The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So yesterday we started the show talking about the retirement of Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. I told you in absolutely no uncertain terms the total, unmitigated, unfettered disaster that it is. Kennedy, sort of the moderate vote in the Supreme Court, but somebody who did support abortion rights, somebody who did support same-sex marriage rights, and many other important areas where he did side with the more liberal, progressive justices. He is going to be gone, and he is going to be replaced by someone of Donald Trump's choosing, who is going to be, without a doubt, an extraordinarily right-wing, wacky ideologue, maybe a religious rightist or maybe a less religious ideologue. My bet would be on a religious right ideologue. And I mentioned yesterday when we talked about this that Roe v. Wade is on the table, okay? Roe v. Wade could disappear as we know it, opening the door to states banning abortion outright, okay? What stands in the way of states saying abortion is just illegal, it's just illegal, it's illegal, you can't do abortions, period, is Roe v. Wade. And we now have, as I mentioned yesterday, more and more legal experts saying expect state bans on abortion as a result of this. Here is legal expert Jeffrey Toobin, Supreme Court expert Jeffrey Toobin, agreeing that abortion is in trouble. He appeared on CNN and he predicts that within a year and a half, we will have 20 state-level abortion bans.
I think sometimes we talk about Supreme Court too much in abstractions about dignity and who's qualified and who's not qualified. Let's talk facts. Let's talk about what America is going to be like that's different. You are going to see 20 states pass laws banning abortion outright, just banning abortion, and because they know that there are now going to be 5 votes on the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade. And abortion will be illegal in a significant part of the United States in 18 months. There is just no doubt about that. And that's why these seats matter.
This is what's at stake. It's not just me saying it. 20 states, according to Jeffrey Toobin, are going to go backwards to the back alley abortions, to the homemade abortions, to the forced miscarriage. This is the direction. And I was thinking, kind of scrambling really, to try to think of any way that this entire fiasco might be an opportunity. And it's pretty grim, but here it is, okay? If we want to really work hard to find something that could be called not even a silver lining, but an opportunity, could this fiasco be an opportunity to come to the full realization that the United States should be divided into more than one country, that the divisions are so deep that grouping states into more than one country might actually make sense? It's not going to happen. It's certainly not peacefully anyway. But that's how extreme this has become. And I recently read A Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, and it was supposed to be a dystopian fantasy, not a prediction of 2024 America or whatever year it is that this is the direction things are going to go. But it's unfortunately becoming closer and closer and closer to the reality we're going to have to contend with.
Do you think the East and West Coasts could unite as one country with another country in the middle of them?
It's not contiguous.
They have to be contiguous? Is that important to you?
It's not contiguous, and that's scary to me. I don't know how you would do it. I don't know how you do it. And really, I've seen actually interesting maps that divide the U.S. into anywhere from 4 to 11 different countries, which still would be reasonably sized European countries, quite frankly. So I don't think it's a population issue. I know it's not going to happen, but I'm trying to say something to the people who say there's simply nothing we can do, right? Remember that Republicans were able to make life hell for Obama during his first 2 years before the Democrats had that terrible 2010 midterm. Anything that Donald Trump wants to do, make it so toxic, so untenable that you paralyze government. That's what needs to happen. Pull out all the stops. Make the energy required to do anything so completely overwhelming and exhausting. Supreme Court nominee is an example. You're not going to stop Trump from appointing someone unless you can delay the appointment until maybe Democrats take over the Senate and then convince Democrats to just filibuster the entire thing. But even if you can't stop it, make it difficult. Make it an uphill battle so that by the time they get done what it is they're trying to get done, it's a Pyrrhic victory, one that is more deflating than whatever benefit is conferred by actually accomplishing what they wanted to accomplish. You aren't going to beat them with logic and reason. You need to make legislating exhausting. It should be exhausting and unbearable to them to have to go and do anything because of how the left gets in the way. I think that's the only way, Pat. I can't think of anything else that we can do at this point other than, of course, voting at every opportunity.
When it comes to this abortion issue, I think conservatives would say that if you live in a state that doesn't allow abortion anymore after, Roe versus Wade is perhaps overturned, you can still use your foot vote, just move to a state that does allow abortion.
Yeah.
That would be the counter argument.
Yeah, of course, a lot of people can't afford to do that. A lot of people also have family where they are, and the idea that, hey, just go somewhere else, it lacks empathy, which is sort of a theme on the right.
15, 16, 17 years old, you can't necessarily just leave your state.
No doubt about it. And Republicans know how to get in the way, right? Republicans know they did it to Obama for most of his presidency. I believe that Democrats have a moral duty at this point to do the exact same thing, if they have the spine for it and if they have the tolerance for it. I genuinely don't know, though, whether Democrats are actually up for doing this. I don't know that they are. We've not seen evidence so far that we can actually count on Democrats to make any accomplishment painstakingly exhausting for Republicans. If I had to bet, and I don't bet, but if I bet, I would probably bet that the Democrats aren't willing to do what it takes.
Yeah, I mean, there are some Democrats out there who are more rough and tumble, right? The Bernie Sanders types, the Maxine Waters types. Problem is, you take a look at the leadership, it's folks like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and they're still, committed to being civil through all of this.
Civility, unfortunately, at this point. Imagine the people who make fun of the left for policing tone are now calling for civility. Do you see the glaring hypocrisy and hilarious double standard? Send me your thoughts about this. What should the left do? What can the left do beyond just calling your elected officials and saying, I hope that you'll do this or that? What should the left be doing? Let me know. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Angela Parise. Angela, thank you for supporting independent media. We depend on the support of great folks like Angela. Also want to thank Leah Gibbs, who is our long-term sustaining member of the day. She's been with us since 2012. Thanks, Leah. Thank you, Angela. Use the coupon code VOTESOON18 to save 40% off of your membership. All right, let's go to the phones and see what's on people's minds. Let's start with our caller from the 623 area code. 623, go ahead.
Hi, David. I'm wondering, every time Sarah Huckabee Sanders or anybody on the right, Trump, anybody on the right refers to it's the Dems' fault when trying to pass their legislation, or, for example, the migrant children, do people actually believe them? Like, they
Which
have
people?
all the power. They have that, the House, the Senate, all the votes to do anything. I'm wondering, do I have this wrong?
When you say do people actually believe it, do you mean do they believe it when they say it, or do voters believe it when they hear it?
Let me clarify. Actually, I'm not talking about like the people with the cognitive dissonance or the base followers, because they're going to follow them no matter what. I'm more talking about like people in general. Do they believe that rhetoric, or do they see past the lies? Because I don't see any good indication that people don't believe that. Last night I just seen that somebody still believes that there were illegal voters in the 2016 election. So
Right. Well, I mean, I think it just depends, because if you say in general versus, so you already said clearly like the committed Trumpists do believe that everything is Obama or the Democrats' fault. So if you take them out of it, then it's like some people do, some people don't. I think the more important thing is, do enough people believe it such that Republicans can win in the midterms and then again in 2020? And I'm scared that the answer is yes. And too many people do believe that it's either some vague Democratic obstruction or something that Obama did or whatever that's responsible for the fact that not everything is going right for the Trump administration and a lot is going wrong. And I think it's something that I have not yet found a way to fight against. I think the path forward is voter turnout is low enough that if people who don't fall for the BS get out and vote, we can take control back. But too many people do believe it. And as you mentioned, some people still believe 3 to 5 million individuals voted illegally for Hillary Clinton. So I don't think you can fight it on a person by person, let me change your mind basis. You just have to get more people out to vote.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I've been trying to do that, my activism myself, but like it's so crazy because like it's just facts. You just look at it and it's like they have this and that and you know anything that they want to do.
Yeah.
I just don't know how to just plainly put it out because they just still don't understand. I don't know.
Yeah, they're not going to, sadly. They're not going to. I really appreciate the call. Thanks very much. 617-830-4750 is the number. Let's try the 970 area code. Caller from 970. Go ahead.
Hi, it's Jackson from Colorado. And,
yeah, go ahead, Jackson.
So my question is, so I'm going to college overseas in Ireland this fall. And since you have family in Argentina, I was kind of wondering, like, how do you explain the Donald Trump phenomenon to someone that might be used to, like, a more progressive political system?
Okay, so I deal with this a lot. I go to Argentina so there's very few black people in Argentina. So when President Obama was president, I'd go to Argentina and people would say, David, what's it like having a black president? And I would have no problem answering that when I would say, it's the same as having a white president. You really evaluate them on policy. Now, though,
Right.
people are saying, what is happening in the United States? What happened with Donald Trump? People must love him. And what I find to be the most effective thing to explain right away, especially when you're talking to people from European countries are much smaller than the United States, and they still can have pretty big differences from one region to another. So first thing is explain how big the United States is, how many people live in the United States, and make it clear that the United States really could be different countries. And if you look at a country like Switzerland, which has a French, German, and Italian region, and you look at in such a small geographical area, how significant the differences are culturally between some of those regions. Look at the United States, which is orders of magnitude bigger, and the differences between Northeast culture and Appalachia and the big, the mountain states and so on. It's so different that you can't really make a broad judgment about what's going on in Boston and New York and DC because 65% of Utah decided to vote for Donald Trump. I think that is one of the most useful things to explain to particularly Europeans about what's happening with Trump in the United States.
I think that's a really good way to look at it. And also, there's lots of differences between like different groups in like within the states. I mean,
sure.
like in California, what people think in San Francisco is going to be very different, but from what people believe in rural parts of the valley. Absolutely.
And you have, on education, on cultural sensitivity, on religion, like you have what are undeniably just massive rifts between American populations, and the people that support Trump could not be more different from the people that oppose Trump in many ways and in many cases. A Boston business bro that supports Trump is not going to be as different from me as, a rural northern Indiana farmer is going to be from me. So it's not like everybody,
right.
that nobody has anything in common, but there's some pretty majorly different cultural issues going on. Good luck in Ireland. That sounds pretty interesting.
Thank you.
All right, appreciate the call. 617-830-4750. Let's see who is next up with us here. Why don't we try the 763 area code? Caller from 763, what's on your mind?
Hey, David. I'm calling in because I wanted to get your take on the competing progressive philosophies. we have people who want to take a third-party approach, and we have people who want to stay in the Democratic Party and try and remake it from within.
Right.
With the progressive victories last night, like Cortez's over Crowley, do you have any idea or any inkling of which side might be more correct?
Well, I don't know that it's a matter of correctness. Like, there's no objective correctness to saying the progressive movement's future is in reforming the Democratic Party and moving it to the left versus the progressive movement's future is in third parties. It's actually much more pragmatic for me, and it's a matter of where can you be most effective. So, for example, where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won, it is undeniably a progressive, significantly Latino district. Am I saying identity politics is why she won? No, but I am saying that a very progressive population or constituency has a big part to do with why she won. She also ran significantly to the left of Congressman Crowley. Congressman Crowley didn't even respect the race enough to show up at a debate, sending a surrogate. So that was an opportunity where, despite having 1/10 the money of Crowley, she was able to win by running to the left. That is a notable move to the left for the Democratic Party. However, we know that incumbency is really strong. Raising more money makes a big difference. And it would be a massive, massive threat to the corporate Democratic establishment if third parties could make inroads. The problem is the system is designed to suppress third parties. So I am a massive supporter of breaking the two-party duopoly. But I think in order to do it, you're going to need a combination of campaign finance reform and some other voting system, some version of ranked choice voting. So I think that it's the wrong approach to say, is it correct to do third party support of progressives or to reform the Democratic Party from within? You've got to use all the tools that are available to do the best you can to move our elected officials to the left. And the answer is not always going to be the same one.
Okay, that's some great insight. Thank you, David.
All right, thank you. Appreciate the call. Yeah, it's not one or the other. It's not about I'm right or you're right. You know, it's about evaluating the systems that we have. Let's go next to the 614 area code. 614, what's on your mind today? 614?
Hello?
Yeah, that's you.
Okay. Yes, I was just wondering, I'm from Australia, so I was wondering, do you think it would take for the Americans to adopt something closer to the Australian gun laws that we have?
I'm sorry, the
here?
Australian, what was the word?
Gun laws?
Oh, gun laws. It would take a monumental shift in attitudes towards firearms. It would take a complete upending of American gun culture. It would, I tend to be on the issue of guns. I actually think that the path forward is a more incremental approach, sort of reminiscent of Ted Kennedy. And I know that sounds boring, but if anybody's waiting around for some kind of massive gun grabbing, gun ban and confiscation of weapons, or it's just not going to happen. And I think that the best path forward is every single election that there is at the local, state, and federal level, when presented with candidates, you go with the one who is most going to focus on the issue of firearms, on gun safety, rather than gun fetishism and permissiveness. And over time, you make a change. And I know that a lot of people will disagree with me. They'll say, no, this is such an acute and pressing issue. You might have to burn it all down and really make a drastic change. I just have a hard time believing that it's going to happen, given the fact that we do have a Second Amendment, that we do have really strong pro-gun voices in the country. Even shooting after shooting after shooting of little kids in schools has not gotten us to any notable changes on that. So I don't know of any circumstances under which we would get in any semi-direct way to Australian gun laws here. I just don't see it.
So you don't think an event like we had in Port Arthur, where that changed everything essentially overnight, could happen in the States at the moment?
Listen, there could be an event that has not happened, which I could dream up and hope that would create seismic shifts immediately in gun policy and attitudes in the United States. We've had horrible shooting after horrible shooting, and still you hear people making excuses from the gun fetishist side. So I'm not super optimistic that any one event would get people to change their minds on guns.
Okay. Thank you, David.
All right. Appreciate it. Thank you very much for the call. I wish that, the reality was more optimistic. I just don't see it.
If we were going to have one of those watershed moments, it would have already happened. Sandy Hook, maybe.
I agree. Or even the consecutive events we've had recently. Let's go to the 508 area code. Possible Massachusetts caller. 508, go ahead.
Hello?
That's you.
Oh, hi, Patrick.
This is David,
I'm
actually.
from New Bedford. My question is, on the ballot is going to be what it's being referred to as a millionaire tax.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to states, I think it's better to just have a flat tax, because obviously these wealthier individuals could go to low tax states or no income tax states. So I was just wondering what your opinion on the millionaire tax is. How should we go about it? What would be the ramifications if passed? Because I believe that's where it's heading.
Okay, so in Massachusetts, there was the idea of putting a millionaire's tax on the ballot. Last I heard, the question is not going to be on the ballot because it addressed both taxation and the spending of that money on education all in one bill, and you've got to disaggregate those two things. You've got to have a question on the taxation, and then separately you can have a question on how that money is going to be spent. So the last I heard is that the millionaire tax ballot question is not going to be on the ballot. I'm not opposed to a millionaire tax. State taxes tend to be flat taxes. In Massachusetts, it's, I believe, 5.3 or 5.25%. You pay that regardless of your income. That's all it is. And what the millionaire tax was going to do was create an additional tax for income. I believe it was above $1 million, although now I'm forgetting because, again, I think it's not going to be on the ballot.
Yeah, 4% tax for education and infrastructure.
And it was going to be spent on education and infrastructure. I would prefer to see not just a flat tax and then a millionaire tax. I think if that's the direction a state wants to go in, I would rather see some degree of a progressive tax. So maybe it becomes lower than 5.3% for people earning lower incomes, and then middle incomes stick with 5.3%, and then maybe you go with something higher at higher incomes. I think just a flat tax plus millionaire's tax isn't necessarily the best way to go, but it is simple, and I get the appeal.
Okay, thank you.
All right, appreciate the call. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think he thought that he was talking to you on that. Or maybe, was it possible his name was Patrick?
Maybe.
It
Maybe
seemed that
he thought
said
he was calling the Pat Ford show.
I think he thought he was calling, what was that, F cubed, the Ford Freedom File or something like that. Okay, next caller is from the 253 area code. Caller from 253, tell us, who are you, where are you calling from, and what's on your mind today?
Hey, this is John. I'm from Tacoma, Washington.
All right, go ahead, John.
And want to kind of talk. Yeah, how's it going? Hey, just want to kind of talk about the net neutrality bill that just didn't affect, that just ended. I guess I'm curious about how you feel that's going to affect your business personally, considering you guys are more of a progressive news station and talk about these kind of things, like the Chambers Report also does, and Ring of Fire, and Specular Talk, and mainstream media basically doesn't. And now I guess my question is, do you feel that these companies that whoever your personal provider is can throttle you guys personally and these other news organizations that might be against their better business, I guess, practices? Or do you feel like they might leave you alone and let you guys do business as normal, or basically something like that?
I am very scared of the repercussions of the net neutrality repeal. I think that if the net neutrality repeal does not hurt progressive independent media, it's because they don't bother trying to hurt us. I think if they want to hurt us, they can hurt us. And hopefully we will just float under the radar and not become a target. But yeah, I think that there's a three-pronged, and I mentioned this earlier in the week, there's a three-pronged attack on progressive independent media right now. Number one is the repeal of net neutrality. Number two is further media consolidation. An example is the approval of AT&T buying Time Warner. And number three is hyper-normalization, which is that when Trump was first elected and YouTube demonetization hit, media, independent progressive media shows like ours experienced a huge resurgence. People saying, we got to deal with this Trump stuff. We've got to deal with YouTube demonetization. I'm going to support the David Pakman show and the other shows that you mentioned. It's been a year now. Scandal is becoming the status quo. And that, combined with net neutrality and media consolidation, it's an uphill battle for independent media. That I wish I could put a better spin on it. But yes, I am scared about it. And all I can do is continue to activate for what I think is right.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think as long as everyone's obviously supporting guys like you, because for me myself, I get a lot of my news from you guys, because you guys talk about a lot of issues that mainstream media just doesn't or isn't allowed to, which is probably more than less the case.
Yeah, I mean, allowed is sort of relative, but yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate the call. I appreciate you pointing to this issue, and we're going to keep talking about it because it is a massive, massive issue. 617-830-4750. Why don't we try the 210 area code? 210 is one of those that it can go a couple different ways depending on who it is.
Where is that? 210?
I think it's 210 San Antonio, maybe. Where are you from, 210?
Hello. My name is Alejandro. I am from San Antonio, Texas, which you were correct.
Thank you.
I am calling today to ask you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I was calling today to ask you. You're really pushing for voting for November. My question to you today is, how do you encourage people to go out and vote? But in particular, the people who probably don't engage in, like, I guess, our culture. Most of the people who struggle, I guess not, what's the word I'm looking for, like, engaging in our culture.
Yeah.
And maybe mostly people who just don't, like, speak English, because a lot of, like, English is not our national language. It's just very common. So, and I know that in Texas, a large portion of Texas is made of Mexican American people too. So my question to you is, how would you reach out to them?
How would I reach out to Spanish speakers and get them to vote? Is that the question?
Yeah. Because they're as much as American as we are.
Of course.
And, you know.
It's boots on the ground, right? It's what you've got to go and talk to people. And you have to understand that every community is different. So when you see, for example, some states reduce Sunday voting hours, early voting hours before elections, who does that impact? Well, it impacts, in some states, it's designed to impact black churchgoers who are going to vote disproportionately Democratic, because you understand some of the culture around black churches and getting together and going to early voting, for example, right, as an example. So in the same way that voter suppression tactics try to consider culture and individual communities, if we're trying to get Mexican American Texans to go out to vote, you have to understand how to reach out to them, right? And whether it's community spaces, religious spaces, more people doing get out the vote who speak Spanish, better being able to communicate why the issues that are on the ballot are going to disproportionately or acutely impact those communities. There's no one answer to your question. It's about, you've got to figure out what it is for any particular community that will get them to go out and vote. And I think it's also important generally just to make sure people understand that their vote matters. And it's really easy. You often hear this talking point. How often are elections decided by one vote? Almost never. So my vote doesn't make a difference. And that is logically fallacious. And the way you fight against that is you say, you're right. Elections aren't often decided by one vote, but they often are decided by fewer votes than the number of people who don't vote because they question the value of their vote. So one vote might not make a difference, but you could have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who say, because it's never decided by a vote, I'm not going to go. And if 100,000 people apply that same logic, collectively, they could now swing the election. So it's really important to be equipped to counter that. One vote doesn't make a difference, so why should I bother narrative? And that's more general than the Mexican American Texan population. But you've got to get boots on the ground, and unfortunately, the right is very good at this.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, sir.
All right. Very much appreciate the call. That is going to do it for calls this week. I apologize to the more than dozen people who are still holding. Sorry we couldn't get to you. We will take calls again, and I look forward to hearing from you next time.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I've been waiting for an opportunity to rerun this week's classic interview. It's with Anthony Papa, and I interviewed him back in 2015. And he's from the Drug Policy Alliance, and he's actually a victim of extreme drug sentencing. And this is so important because we are talking a lot lately about these pardons from President Trump. We talked about the pardoning of Alice Marie Johnson. We've talked about the possibility of pardoning others in the future, but also what seem to be sort of like political or optics or wasted pardons from Donald Trump. And so in reviewing this interview with Anthony Papa, what I want to think about as we listen to it is when we prioritize pardons, what should we be thinking of? What should the principles and priorities be? And with that, let's check out my interview from October of 2015 with Anthony Papa. I'm joined today by Anthony Papa, who's manager of media relations for the Drug Policy Alliance. He also has personal experience with the criminal justice system and the war on drugs. He was sentenced to 15 years to life and ultimately served 12 years in Sing Sing. Anthony, it's great to have you. Let's start, for people who may not be familiar with your story, talk to us a little bit about your conviction.
Thanks for having me on your show. I was a first-time nonviolent drug offender. In 1985, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I got involved with drug activity. A person, a bowler on my bowling team, asked me why I was coming late to the league all the time. And I told him my car keeps breaking down. He said, why don't you fix it? I didn't have any money. Well, from that point on, he introduced me to someone who was dealing drugs in the bowling alleys of Westchester County. He asked me if I wanted to make a fast dollar. I said, for what? He says, deliver an envelope from the Bronx to Mount Vernon, and I'll give you $500. At first, I said no because I knew what it was about, and I passed it by. So a couple of months later, it was Christmas time. Things got desperate. I needed money, and he asked me again, and I said, I'll do it. So I wound up bringing this envelope containing 4.5 ounces of cocaine up from the Bronx to Mount Vernon. But I walked into a police sting operation. 20 cops came out of nowhere, was placed under arrest, and I did everything I could do wrong. And eventually I was sentenced to 15 years to life under the Rockefeller drug laws, which mandates mandatory minimum sentencing.
And were you, did this go to trial or did you take a plea deal?
No, I took a plea. They actually offered me 3 to life because they knew I wasn't a drug dealer. But I didn't want to leave my wife and my 7-year-old daughter. And I went to trial. And it was a big mistake because I got walloped with 2 15 to life sentences, one for sales, one for possession of the 4.5 ounces of cocaine. But since I was a first-time nonviolent drug offender, the judge gave me a break, ran the sentences together. So I only had 1 15 to life sentence. I served at Sing Sing Correctional Facility.
And talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, were you, what types of other offenders were you imprisoned with? Was it similar to the crime you had been convicted of, or was it drastically different? Violent crime, etc.
It was a mixed bag. I mean, you know, everybody. I went to Sing Sing. It's a maximum security prison, so you're sentenced along with others that had sentenced for murder, rape. I mean, just heinous crimes, and it was a nightmare experience to say the least. You know, when I was in prison, I was lost. I didn't know what to do. I lost my identity, who I was in life, and I became prisoner number 85A2837. What saved my life was my discovery of art, where through another prisoner, I learned that I was an artist. Prison is a very existential environment. And what I mean by that is there's something mystical about being imprisoned in a 6x9 cage for many years. you find out about yourself. So for me, I found out that I was an artist. And 3 years later, 1988, I was sitting in my cell, picked up a mirror, looked in the mirror. I saw an individual who's going to spend the most productive years of his life in a cage. And I painted this self-portrait, titled it 15 to Life. 7 years later, wound up at the Whitney Museum of American Art while I was in prison. I got a lot of publicity on my case, and Governor George Pataki granted me executive clemency.
And while you were incarcerated, you also did many things that other inmates don't do, right? I mean, you earned 2 bachelor's degrees, you got a master's degree. You, as you mentioned, you had George Pataki grant you clemency. After you were released, you did some acting. You were on HBO's Oz. You've been in several films. But even with all that notwithstanding, you still have been at the mercy of the challenges that exist for formerly incarcerated persons, right? I mean, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it was a tough experience. You know, it's a rude awakening. You spend an enormous amount of time in prison, and then suddenly you're free. Like these people coming out now, there's about 6,000 that are coming out under these new changes in the law.
Right.
And they're about to enter society, and they're in for a rude awakening. It's tough. Every step of the way for an ex-offender, you're blocked with housing, employment. It's hard for ex-offender. You're labeled an ex-offender, and you wear that label for the rest of your life. For me, it's my 18th year of freedom, and I still feel the stigma of being an ex-offender. I just wrote about it in a new book. I actually had to address this issue of people coming home. It's called Men and Women Returning Home in an Age of Reform. It's available on Kindle, on Amazon. And basically what I try to do is use my story as an art, telling men and women who are coming home about my experiences. Because prison doesn't end at the prison wall. It goes beyond the wall. It affects families, loved ones, those on the outside. And one thing people don't realize is that when you come into the free world from prison, you drag along with you all the baggage that you use to survive imprisonment, all the coping mechanisms, and you bring them with you in the free world. And at times they suddenly appear, and you have no control over them. And it's a very dangerous situation when this occurs.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, in thinking of sort of the broader problems we have the sort of status quo of the war on drugs. We have mandatory minimums. We have, in many cases, not in your particular case, but we have plea deals and the sort of plea deal structure that is set up to really hurt a lot of nonviolent offenders. You have the sort of punitive nature of incarceration as opposed to rehabilitative. What's the top priority? Or in other words, what's the lowest hanging fruit that could be tackled first that would have the most impact?
You mean when people are returning to the free world?
Just in general, in terms of reform, what are the first changes that might have the big impact? Is it talking about mandatory minimums? Is it about what the prisons are like, et cetera?
I think that mandatory minimums have become a poison that has destroyed our criminal justice system. President Obama is speaking about this. And there's legislation now that exists, actually bipartisan legislation, which has passed the Senate, and we're waiting for Congress to act on it, which would reduce mandatory minimum sentencing. What mandatory minimum sentencing does, it takes away the discretion of the judge to look at the totality of facts. So, for example, in my case, I got 15 years to life as a first-time nonviolent drug offender. That didn't matter. What mattered was the weight involved of the drug, the 4.5 ounces of cocaine. So under the Rockefeller drug laws, which mandate mandatory minimum sentencing, I passed this envelope with 4.5 ounces. 2-ounce sale or 4-ounce possession at the time I got arrested would give you a 15 to life sentence or better. Men and women have received these sentences 15, 20, 25 years, mandatory minimum sentencing. And these laws have become, under the federal sentencing, these were the original laws in 1973 when it enacted under the Rockefeller drug laws. It eventually became mandatory minimum sentencing laws in the federal government, where every state had some sort of mandatory minimum sentencing law. Those laws have destroyed our system. It has increased prisons to the capacity where the prisons are exploding at the seams. Now, because of it became a monetary issue, everybody, politicians from the left, from the right, are getting together and realizing that it's not cost efficient, these laws. It's a waste of tax dollars, a waste of human lives. Money could be better spent on needy communities to put shoes on shoeless children. So politicians are now acting on this issue, and with the lead from President Obama, hopefully mass incarceration will end.
All right, we've been speaking with Anthony Papa. I'll remind you, the new book is an open letter to men and women returning home in an age of reform. He's with the Drug Policy Alliance. Thanks so much for sharing your story with us.
Yeah, and if you want to know more about our organization, it's drugpolicy.org, or you could go to my website, 15tolife.com, and see my art and my story. Thanks very much for having me as a guest.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've got some great audience questions this week. Remember, you can submit your audience questions by submitting an email at davidpakman.com on the contact form. First question this week. Hey, David, what's the worst thing you've seen someone do on public transportation? You know, there's a lot of really horrible things I've seen on public transportation. I don't even know if urinating on the subway even counts, because it's such a frequent thing now in big cities that it barely even warrants a mention. You know, it's like the urination outside and even inside at this point doesn't even faze me in any way. Defecation I've not seen, and that may be a different story. One of the worst incidents I experienced was actually a guy collecting his mucus, and it sounds bonkers, and it is. There was a guy, and former producer Lewis was actually on the train with me when this happened. There was a guy with a plastic bag collecting his mucus, and I mean, it's vile and gross. There was clearly mental illness at play, but it was probably the most horrible thing I saw on public transit. And then beyond that, it's not so much what I've seen people do, but I've experienced just people who smell really, really bad. And you would think, oh, you know, homeless people don't have a place to shower. These did not appear to be homeless people. It was people who just seemed to not shower and just have absolutely rancid body odor. And, you know, I know that there's a medical condition that makes body odor particularly bad. It's possible that they had that. I'm not making fun of anybody, but those were some of the worst experiences I've had.
Yeah, for me, I remember seeing a guy, I forget what city it was, just passed out, resting on 2 seats.
Okay.
And his own vomit was partially on himself and also on the ground of the subway. And the worst part about that is every time the subway moves, you know, and comes to a complete stop, the puke would slide across the subway car. So you'd have to like move around to try to avoid it. That was pretty bad. Yeah,
that sounds pretty bad. I've not actually seen some of the really bad stories that some people have talked about. My girlfriend was once attacked by another woman who, for whatever reason, didn't seem to like her and was sort of giving her the evil eye for a while on a bus. And when they got off, the woman came over from about 20 feet away and just opened an umbrella right into her face.
Whoa.
And then closed it and walked away. And a couple people came over and said that woman did that on purpose. And everybody was just so dazed that nothing happened. And that was but again, that's not, it's bad, but it's not like something so crazy that is unbelievable, right? I mean, these things happen on public transit, I guess, or at least I've been told.
Yeah, technically an assault.
It
I'm
is.
sure your girlfriend was fine from that. I don't
Yeah.
think an umbrella getting
A
hit
little
by
bit of
an
a
umbrella
fat
would be
lip.
too bad.
Yeah, a little bit
really?
of a fat lip. Yeah,
In the
yeah,
face?
yeah. Yep, it was right in the
That's pretty
face.
bad. I was
Right
going to
in the
ask if you had seen any fights on public transit, because
You
I've
know,
seen some close calls.
Just the other day, I actually had at Downtown Crossing in Boston, there was a very elderly woman walking down the stairs to get down to the red line, and there were two people helping her. And as a result of this, they were blocking the full width of the stairs. Now, certainly, they probably should have used the elevator, but they weren't. Okay, elderly lady is being helped down. A big crowd starts to form, and one guy starts yelling, saying, "Go, go, go." Another guy takes offense and says, "There's an old lady, stop pushing, stop pushing."
yeah.
Those two guys start to escalate into what becomes almost a fight. And it's just a misunderstanding, right? The guy yelling to go didn't know that there was an elderly lady. The guy yelling there's an elderly lady didn't realize that the other guy probably had a bad day and was just trying to get to the subway, whatever. So we get to the actual platform, and they both take off their jackets, which is, of course, what you do when you're getting ready to fight.
Of course.
And they start saying, "Well, I'm right here." And the other guy goes, "Great, I'm right here." And it's basically one of these situations where neither wants to be perceived as backing away from the fight, but at the same time, neither of them really wants to actually fight. So they both just make it clear that they're there, and if the other guy wants to start the fight, they will be there to defend themselves. But it's also clear that they don't really want to fight. And it was just a lot of yelling, no physical contact. And then this little immigrant Hispanic guy comes over and stands in between the two of them, and this guy is half the size of both of these guys, and says, "Guys, it was a misunderstanding. It was a misunderstanding.
Good.
You guys don't want to. You don't want to do this." And it actually de-escalated the entire thing. And I ended up talking to that guy and just out of curiosity asking him where he's from. He was from Peru. You know, the long story. That guy actually ended up breaking up what was potentially a fight that nobody really wanted to have.
And then the old lady who caused all this commotion
Had no idea.
knocked out everyone.
Right.
And that's how it ended.
She had no idea. She had no idea what was going on, and that her presence even caused the problem. Next question today. Should a seat on a state Supreme Court be an elected position? I don't distinguish between what should be the policy on the national Supreme Court, the Supreme Court of the United States, and state Supreme Courts. I have a real problem with elections for any kind of judge. I think that that is really problematic. However, we know that giving the right to appoint judges for life to people who happen to be in office at the time that there's a vacancy is also really problematic. So rather than focusing on elected versus appointed, I think that there should be term limits, period, on appointed positions. The move to elections is problematic for me because the general public makes very bad decisions all the time. At the same time, you could make a case for the election over the political appointment, but I actually think that a better move would be we maintain these Supreme Court seats as political appointments or move them where they're not to political appointments, but term limit them, because the most corrupting factor or influence on someone who is making these decisions that for others are life-altering decisions about sentences and prison time and so on and so forth, is that if the person making the decision is there for life, that is a real problem. You could make the case that if they know they have an election to answer to, that might make them more accountable, and I'm open to that. But term limiting, I actually think, is something we should really be looking at when it comes to Supreme Courts.
I also think that if judges are elected instead of appointed by the executive, be it governor or the president, it would throw the entire balance of power out of whack. Like the checks and balances that we have now wouldn't be the same, because that's the control that the executive has over the judicial branch right now, that they get to appoint them, and of course the legislature approves or declines that.
That's interesting. And it would change, certainly, the balance of power and sort of those checks and balances. Whatever your position, let me put it this way. I want to hear from you about elected versus appointed Supreme Court justices at the federal and state level. But what I want to get your feedback on is, what about term limits? No more serving for life, whether it's elected or appointed. If it's elected, you can only get reelected a certain number of times. And if it's appointed, it only lasts a certain amount of time. Maybe it's 10 years. I understand that a lot of cases last many years. So
yeah, 10 years
2,
is good.
4, or even 6-year terms for a U.S. Supreme Court justice maybe would be too short. But you got to put a limit on it because it is a real problem that we're dealing with. Last question today. Hey, David, what's your most vivid experience of culture shock? You know, growing up, when I would go back, as many of you know, I was born in Argentina and moved to the United States when I was 5 years old and would go back to visit sometimes every year, but sometimes every 3 or 4 years, depending on what was going on in life at the time. When I would get back to Argentina, I would experience some culture shock. At the time, being a kid, I wasn't really traveling a lot where I was being exposed to new cultures on a regular basis. So I wasn't really accustomed to familiarizing myself with different cultures on a regular basis. So when I would go back to Argentina, I would just have like a general culture shock. It wasn't about anything in particular. It wasn't about the time people eat dinner or the way people relate to each other or anything in particular. It was like an overall culture shock. More as an adult, I really haven't experienced, you know, the major culture shock I've experienced is more within the United States than outside of it. And this actually goes to something I've been thinking about for a while and I've talked to friends about recently, which is that I believe that within the United States, there are more significant cultural differences than there are between metropolitan coastal city dwellers in the United States and city dwellers in Western Europe, for example. In other words, I find that although there are obviously cultural differences between Bostonians and Parisians, that Bostonians and Parisians have a lot of things in common that a Bostonian and someone from Appalachia or Appalachia, I don't know how it's
either one, I
at
think.
this point, or South Dakota or rural Wyoming would have. I find that when I go, like when I travel to northern Humboldt County, California, that I had nothing in common with the people there. We were all lived in the United States. We all spoke English, but I had far less in common with them than I do with people in Montreal or people in Madrid. And that is part of the United States really having very disparate cultures within it.
I feel like the language piece is a big aspect.
It's a big one.
If you grow up in the United States or you're used to only speaking English,
yeah,
and you know, you say you go to France for a month and you have a very tough time communicating with people, you're going to get some culture shock from that.
Yeah, but I feel like you get used to that. Yeah, after a while, you get used to the fact that people speak a different language. Doesn't mean you understand it. You might start picking up a few words, but I do think that as far as the shock element, you adjust to that. After spending several days in northern Humboldt County, or after spending time in rural northern Indiana, as I got to do about 6 or 8 months ago, the culture differences don't evaporate after a week, whereas I get used to hearing Dutch or French or whatever after a few days in a European city.
I wouldn't say that I've experienced culture shock myself, but in talking to people, it sounds like people tend to get it coming back to their home country rather than visiting, and I think that's what you expressed. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. I'm open to hearing from people, and I've never traveled to Asia, and I know that there are folks who have traveled to Asia who describe culture shock as much more significant, and I'm hoping to visit Asia in the next few years, but I'd be sort of open to that being a different experience. Send me your thoughts. We've got a great bonus show for you today. 2 ways to access it: www.joinpacman.com or patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Both give you access to the supporter-only, world-famous bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.